Welcome to Kairos Research Center podcast, Christian faith seeking understanding, intellectual witness, and spiritual renewal.
Let's grant that the Bible makes sense on its own terms, and that you have shown that it makes sense to believe that God created the universe as well as humanity. But we face problems with your topic right from the start. The Bible says God created humanity in His image. The phrase God created humanity in His image is not familiar to most of our contemporaries. Instead, there is some confusion over what this means. Can you explain what this phrase means in the context of Genesis 1 to 11?
Let us look at the key text, Genesis 1, 26 to 28. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. What is the meaning of the image of God in this text? Verse 26 is translated as, "Let us make man in our image, and let them have dominion." This is a literal translation. Grammatically in Hebrew, "let us" and "let them" expresses purpose or result. Thus the verse should be translated as, "Let us make man in our image, so that," with the purpose that, "they have dominion." Also, in verse 26, the phrase "in our image" is explained by "after our likeness," that is, according to God's likeness. In other words, being made in the image of God means humanity is like God. Of course, humanity is not like God in every way. We have bodies, and God does not, to begin with. Obviously, humanity is like God only in some ways. Hence, the text can be summarized as follows. God created humanity in His own image, that is, according to His own likeness. This is so that humanity fulfills God's purpose for them, which is to have dominion over God's creation. Now, the image of God is what we are as human beings, and it distinguishes and identifies human beings from all other creatures. In other words, the image of God is our identity as human beings. Our identity is secure because it is based on what we are, which cannot change and cannot be changed. Our identity is insecure if we base it on what we do or what we are supposed to do. For example, if a man's identity is his profession, say a doctor, what happens if he loses his license to practice medicine? He loses his identity as well. This will be devastating. Thus far, it is relatively clear what image of God means. But confusion arises when we limit the image of God to certain aspects of humanity. Like say, the image of God is our ability to reason and choose between right and wrong, or our ability to relate to God and to one another. It is subjective to decide which aspect of humanity is the image of God. God made humanity, male and female, to be like God. Human beings in their totality, both body and soul, is the image of God. But how can the human body be part of the image of God when God has no body? Like God, we can think and speak. This is not the case with animals. But unlike God, we need the body to think and speak. When our organs related to thinking and speaking are damaged, we can no longer think and speak. So to be like God, to be able to think and speak, we need a body. In this sense, the body is part of the image of God. If we do not limit the image of God to certain aspects of humanity, in what ways are we like God? We need to take a look at what the Bible clearly teaches about God and about humanity and match what is true about God and what is also true about humanity. Our likeness to God can be summarized into three categories: God-like nature, God-like qualities, and God-like abilities. Firstly, God-like nature. Like God, human beings are persons. Basically, this means humans are self-conscious beings who can think, reason, feel, and make choices. So they are responsible for their actions, and they can have fellowship with one another as well as with God Himself. As for God-like abilities, like God, humans have the capacity to love and the sense of justice. Like personhood, these qualities are universally observed and experienced. So human beings are responsible to live out these qualities to fulfill God's purpose for humanity. Finally, God-like abilities. Like God, besides the ability to communicate, humans also have the ability to create. God created human life. Humans, being male and female, can procreate human life. Now, animals can also procreate, but they do so by instinct. Humans do so by choice. The image of God is not limited to procreation, but the totality of human beings. The God-like ability to create is uncannily seen in the ability to create computer software. Bill Gates says, human DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we have ever created. Even foremost atheist Richard Dawkins confirms that the machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. Based on the teaching of Genesis 1 and 2, we can conclude that the genetic code in the human DNA is part of the creative work of God. He designed it. The creative work of software engineers is clearly God-like. The more artificial intelligence advances, the more we see how God-like humans are in terms of the ability to create. The nature and complexity of human DNA renders materialism speechless. Materialism claims that humanity came about by random chance through a process called evolution. But how could random chance produce such complexity? Because of this, even the then foremost atheist, Anthony Flew, changed his mind and believed in the existence of God. So even in the context of the modern world of science, a foremost atheist accepted the truth of Genesis 1:1. In the context of scientific discoveries, such as the nature and complexity of human DNA, Genesis 1:1 makes perfect sense, whereas materialism makes no sense. This further corroborates our assumption that the world of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation represents the real world we live in.
Dr. Leong, you describe human beings as persons who are responsible for their actions as they live out their godlike qualities. I suppose that as in creation, God gives humanity such qualities for a purpose. Can you elaborate on God's design or purpose of humanity in granting them such qualities?
This brings us to the Garden of Eden and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. There is still confusion over the meaning of this tree. The key to understand what it means is Genesis 3:5. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Ironically, these are the tempting words of the serpent. But the words are true, for they are confirmed by God Himself. After Adam had eaten from the tree, God said, Behold, the man has become like one of us, in knowing good and evil. Genesis 3:22. So to eat from the tree is to become like God in a way that humanity was not designed to be. It is to be like God in having the knowledge of good and evil. What then is this knowledge? And how does eating from the tree result in gaining this knowledge? We need to bear in mind two things. Firstly, the Hebrew word for knowledge does not refer to what we call head knowledge, but experiential knowledge. The first time the word know occurs in the Bible is in Genesis 4:1. Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain. This knowing is the most intimate knowledge between two human beings. We cannot say we have known something if we have not experienced it in some way. Secondly, the phrase knowledge of good and evil or knowing good and evil function as an idiom. The meaning of an idiomatic phrase cannot be derived from just combining the meanings of the words. Consider the English idiom, know the ropes. It means to know how to do something and not know about ropes. The meaning of an idiomatic phrase can often be inferred from the context it is used. For example, we can infer the meaning of the phrase know the ropes from the following sentence taken from the internet. The best way to go into a business is to first find a mentor, free or paid, who knows the ropes to teach you. There are two other contexts in Genesis where the words good and evil are used in an idiomatic expression. These cases not only confirm that knowing good and evil is an idiom, but they also help us determine its meaning. We will look at the first case. In Genesis 24, we read that Abraham sent his trusted servant from Canaan to Mesopotamia to find a wife for his son Isaac. When the servant reached the town, he asked God to help him identify the woman God had chosen for Isaac. That woman turned out to be Rebekah, Abraham's grandniece. When he asked for permission from her family to take her back to Canaan, he recounted how God had enabled him to identify Rebekah as God's choice. Laban and Bethuel, her brother and father, replied, "The matter has come from the Lord. We cannot speak to you evil or good." Genesis 24:50. The words evil and good are used here in an idiomatic expression. So the NIV translates it as, "We can say nothing to you one way or another." In this context, it is clear what they were saying. God had already chosen Rebekah. It was not up to them to decide and answer one way or another. They could not even say yes to agree with God. They later asked Rebekah if she would go with them. But as for them, they had no say whatsoever over the matter. Hence, good and evil are used here in an idiomatic expression to mean the lack of autonomy or freedom in decision making. Exercising autonomy to answer one way or another means usurping the prerogative of God. In the context of Genesis 2 and 3, the idea of autonomy in decision making fits in perfectly the phrase knowing good and evil. God had explicitly commanded Adam and Eve not to eat from the tree of knowledge and good and evil. The very act of eating from it is itself an act of exercising autonomy from God. Committing this act means experiencing and thus knowing autonomy in deciding what is good and evil, that is, what is right and wrong. Only God has the autonomy to decide what is right and wrong. In yielding to the temptation, Adam and Eve yielded to the desire to be like God in this forbidden manner. There's a difference between deciding what is right and wrong and discerning what is right and wrong. Deciding what is right and wrong is God's prerogative. Discerning what is right and wrong is our responsibility. We are to discern what is right and wrong based on God's commandments. God's commandments are about love and justice. It can be summed up as love your neighbor as yourself or do justice and love mercy. So God created humanity with the capacity to love and the sense of justice to enable humanity to discern what is right and wrong, as well as to avoid what is wrong and do what is right. This brings us to a related issue that I will only mention in passing, just to show the relevance of God's design for humanity in the modern world of science. When Eve fell into temptation to eat from the tree, She exercised autonomy from God as to what is right and what is wrong. But what led her to do that? She believed the words of the serpent rather than the words of God. God said, "If you eat of the tree, you will surely die." But the serpent said, "You will not surely die." Who spoke the truth? Eve decided on her own. Who spoke the truth? She exercised autonomy from God as to what is true and what is false. Exercising autonomy from God as to what is true and as to what is right go hand in hand. God made human beings as persons so that they could think, reason, and make decisions. God's design for personhood is that humanity would not exercise autonomy from God as to how they think, reason, and make decisions. What happens when a civilization rejects God and exercises autonomy from God? Genesis presents the answer most graphically in terms of the civilization that God destroyed through the flood. Now the modern world of science has become such a civilization. Would we decide on our own who speaks the truth when the claims of materialists contradict the teachings of the Bible?